wanted to take a moment to acknowledge today that our virtual webinar is, I'm calling in from Ottawa, Ontario, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples who have lived on this territory for a millennium. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. And although we all work and live in different places across Turtle Island, you're also calling in from a different traditional Indigenous territory than others today. I encourage you to take some time to reflect on this. And if you aren't sure which Indigenous and treaty lands you are occupying today, we encourage you to check out native-land.org to find a map today. And feel free to share where you're joining us in the chat. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm excited to get started and introduce you to Dr. Christy Morrisey, our expert guest speaker today. She is a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Saskatchewan. Her research focuses on the effects of environmental contaminations on birds, insects, rivers, and wetlands. Christy has over 23 years of experience working on issues related to agricultural pesticides and other chemicals, and the use of birds as indicators of environmental health. And that ties in really nicely with this year's conservation theme, Protect Insects to Protect Birds. Christy is working on the Living Lab and related projects to implement nature-based solutions to improve sustainable agriculture production in the prairies. Dr. Morrisey has published over 90 highly cited journal articles and book chapters, and in 2020 was named to the Royal Society College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. Her work has also been featured broadly in the national and international media and documentaries, such as CBC, National Geographic, The Nature of Things, as well as the Bird Window collision documentary, The Messenger. So thank you again, everyone, for tuning in today. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Christy.
Wonderful. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Autumn. And thanks to all of you who are joining from wherever your lovely computer is. I'm here in Saskatoon in Saskatchewan, and delighted to talk to you today about, well, in celebration for World Migratory Bird Day, some of the beauty of birds, but also some of the threats and how we can address those. So thank you again. All right, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the specific problem of agricultural pesticide use, and I'm going to try to draw some links both to birds, but also to insects, because I do study both. And just kind of to get us going or thinking as my screen decides to wake up. There we go. Obviously, one of the things we're worried about is how much biodiversity has declined. And for those of you who have been keeping track, this is a global problem, and biodiversity has declined by almost 70% since 1970. And birds are a prominent group that we've been tracking simply because people recognize birds. Birds are probably one of the most well-studied groups. And so we know they too are declining at that similar rapid rate. And some of the causes that have been identified have been identified as habitat loss and just degradation. Of course, here a devastating scene of deforestation. Other threats to birds include overexploitation, like this buzzard that's been illegally captured, and there's an enormous bird trade industry around the world. Invasive species, like the brown rat, that has invaded many islands and areas that are very sensitive bird habitats and biodiversity areas, often decimating populations. And climate change, of course, is prominent in many of our news stories, and climate change causes a number of threats to birds, particularly migratory species that have to navigate through storms and changes in weather and arriving on the breeding grounds in unknown conditions. And of course, one area that I study a lot is the effects of pollution, which of course are often hard to see directly. Pollution affects air and water and land. And of course, we're all subjected to pollution, and birds can be indicators of this threat. So one of the uh, dominant hypotheses, though, that has been put forward for some of the losses of biodiversity, and particularly migratory birds, has been some changes in agriculture. And of course, agriculture has been going on for millennia. But some of the more recent changes in agriculture in Canada and indeed in the US, as well as other parts of the world, have been fairly striking in the last, say, 4 decades. Um, 4 to 6 decades. And these seem to be timed with when bird declines also have been the most rapid. So some of the things, I don't want you to read this whole table, but basically in Canada, we know that in the 1960s, the area that was farmed is pretty similar to the area that's been farmed today. So we have sort of 70 million hectares of farmland in 1966, and today it's about 64 million. So it's actually slightly less. Whereas it's not just the total area that's being farmed, but actually the number of farms has actually decreased almost by over half, and the average farm size has gotten bigger. So farms on average in Canada are now 315 hectares in size, and in the 1960s they were about 163 hectares. And so we know that this kind of change in the amount of and intensity of farming has been a prominent feature, not only here in Canada, but in the US, which is mirroring the same kind of results as well as elsewhere in the world. And for many people who are tracking this problem, one of the key issues is not just having bigger farms, but simply having a bigger farm means you have to rely more on chemicals, agrochemicals, in order to maintain that sort of farming system. Because these farming systems now are very simple, very monocultures, large scale, and so much like industrial practices that have happened in other parts of manufacturing and elsewhere, farming has become very industrial, and thus we're using more pesticides to control pests to maintain that system. And the risk from pesticide pollution now is a global problem, and you can see on this map that 75% or 3/4 of the global agricultural land is at some risk of pesticide pollution. And here in Canada, we're not immune to that. We have some of the highest pollution risk from pesticides in our agricultural regions. One of the groups of chemicals that's been particularly problematic, and you might have heard about them in the news, is the neonicotinoids. So neonicotinoids are a class of insecticides that came onto the market in the early 90s. And they were introduced largely because they were safer for human health. They had a lower toxicity profile to humans, and they could be applied often as a seed treatment. So they felt this was a targeted kind of approach to using these insecticides. But now the issue is that neonicotinoids became so popular that they're used absolutely everywhere. I don't have a map here for Canada, but in the US, basically in the entire agricultural region of the US has neonicotinoids applied, and same is true in Canada. They also persist in the environment. These chemicals have a half-life in soil that can range upwards of 3 years. And in fact, the DT90, that is the time for 90% of this chemical to dissipate, can be upwards of 12 years in soil. So we know that they stick around for a very long time. They also move. When you apply them to this coating of a seed, they don't stay on the coating of the seed. They're highly water soluble, and thus they actually move into surface water and groundwater very readily. And finally, they are extremely toxic. Although they were designed to be less toxic to humans, they are still extremely toxic to insects, as well as other small organisms like birds. So what are the overall concerns for migratory birds from these chemicals? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research we've been doing. And to kind of orient you a little, neonicotinoids, they come in all kinds of colors. This is blue treated seed, canola seed, but they can affect birds in different ways. So firstly, they can affect them indirectly. That is if the insects are exposed to these chemicals and they maybe perhaps don't die, they get some concentration in their tissues and birds eat them. So that might be a problem. Or they might actually eat sort of treated seeds. This is a problem. But indirect effects through reduced prey might be a serious issue that we're probably overlooking. That is, if these chemicals reduce the amount of insects available, now we have insectivorous birds that have to work a lot harder to try and find enough insect prey. So let's talk a little bit about some of the evidence for these indirect effects. Well, one of the sort of landmark studies that came out in 2014 from the Netherlands was done by Hallman et al. And they had some amazing data on water quality concentrations of neonicotinoids in various streams, rivers, and ponded water across the country. And they had some very good historic data. In fact, they mapped all of this data, and you can see the concentrations of imidacloprid, one of the main neonicotinoids used in agriculture. And the red areas show the highest concentrations, white show the lowest concentrations. And then the authors went one step further, and they related this to bird declines. And they found that for 15 different farmland bird species, including the barn swallow shown here, the numbers of birds, their overall population size, decreased on average by 3.5% per year in areas where the concentrations of that imidacloprid in water were above this very unique threshold, or very low threshold of 20 nanograms per liter. So as long as there is some contamination of these ponds, they were actually seeing this dramatic decline in bird populations. And they looked at all kinds of other things that might be sort of spuriously related to it. And they found that this was the strongest explanatory variable in all of the models that they ran. Now, here in Canada, we have 4 agricultural regions. I've shown these on the map. So maybe you're living in one of these areas. They only make up about 7% of our land mass. So agricultural land is, in comparison to Canada's overall land mass, we don't have a lot of area that is in agriculture. However, the one area that's got a lot of it is the prairie region. So 82% of Canada's agricultural land is right here in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. So the prairie region shown here in this map is one area where we use a lot of agrochemicals. And in fact, we have the largest area of application of insecticides, and as well herbicides, fungicides, as well as we have the highest mass of insecticides applied. So where there's data on the pesticide use, the prairie provinces have the highest, and indeed Saskatchewan is sort of the worst offender here. If you live in southern Alberta, southern Ontario, or in Quebec, you also will have fairly high use, but it still pales in comparison to the overall use in the prairie region by mass. And so we've been doing some sampling of water across the prairie region, trying to understand what chemicals are in the water and what might be affecting birds and insects and other wildlife. So from 2017 to 2019, we sampled all these wetlands, over 300 different water bodies across the prairie region. And we found a whole slew of different chemicals, not surprisingly, in those prairie wetlands. And they varied by year and they varied by chemical type. But basically, one of the things you can see is that herbicides, which are in green, show up a lot, as well as insecticides in blue. And insecticides are particularly problematic because they are the most toxic chemicals. And indeed, the 2 insecticides that show up the most are thiamethoxam and clothianidin. which are neonicotinoids. And when we look at the sort of overall pattern or risk of these chemicals, because they're all in mixtures in these wetlands, we know that a lot of the things that end up in these wetlands are sort of lower toxicity, like some of the herbicides tend to be lower toxicity, but some of them, like that thimethoxam and clothianidin, can have higher toxicity. And we found that wetlands on average, 49% of the wetlands exceeded a risk threshold for aquatic life based on the insecticide concentrations that were found. So we know that these chemicals are at high enough concentrations to affect aquatic insects. And that's bad news for birds. Why? Because when we have studied this, we know that the more chemicals, the more pesticides that are in the wetlands, the fewer invertebrates, aquatic invertebrates there are. So there is a really strong association with pesticide pollution, reducing the overall diversity as well as abundance of aquatic insects. And that's bad news for birds who depend on those insects for food. Now, neonicotinoids, people have asked me for a long time, well, you told us they were supposed to be safer. So how on earth did these things get registered for use when they're, did the chemical companies not test these or study these? Did the registrants like Health Canada, did they not review these? Well, as it turns out, seed treatments were designed to be safer, as I said, for humans. But for aquatic insects, it turns out there's a huge range in sort of their sensitivity. And now we've pieced together kind of which insects, which invertebrates are more sensitive to neonicotinoids. And it turns out the ones that were tested originally were this Daphnia magna, which happen to be extremely insensitive to neonicotinoids. They're just sort of uniquely resistant to the chemical. The ones that are the most sensitive are all these insect species down at the bottom of this curve, and they are things like midges and mayflies. And those are the most important for some insectivorous birds. And we know that they are affected by neonicotinoids at very low concentrations, causing effects on survival, their emergence, biomass, and even behavior. So I've just kind of illustrated how these neonicotinoids and indeed insecticides in general can affect birds indirectly through reducing or altering their invertebrate prey. But let's talk a little bit about how they could affect them directly. That is, if they eat some contaminated, say, seeds or insects, and that causes some toxicity for them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research we've done on this area. Now, one of the things that's unique about sort of modern agriculture, and indeed why neonicotinoids became so prevalent, is because they were used as seed treatments. Seed treatments have been around for many decades. However, they took off in their sort of popularity when the neonicotinoids were introduced. So these seed treatments allow farmers to just plant the seed with the chemical coating on it, and they don't have to come back and do sprays. Although I have to say they still do come back and do the sprays. But we found that when they do seed these in the spring, they're often failing to seed them completely or bury them completely, and there's often these spills. So there's a huge amount of this treated seed that's exposed on the surface of the soil, and people have now been documenting this regularly. Unfortunately, the regulators in Canada and the US assumed that the risks from this treated seed being left on the surface would be not really problematic to birds, because they thought that birds would learn to avoid eating treated seeds or have some kind of repellency to it simply because it makes them sick. So if they eat a little bit of it, they might actually get sick, and that would somehow give them an aversion. This is like you and I going to the bad Chinese restaurant and getting sick. Well, you're probably not going to go back there, right? You decide, well, that was terrible. But in order for you to experience that and avoid going back to that Chinese food restaurant, you're going to have to experience some, gastrointestinal distress, and, you might have a night that's pretty horrible. Well, for a bird, that's what they have to experience too. And the likelihood of them being able to survive that and indeed learn where they got sick or what made them sick could be very challenging. But industry did do some studies on this, and they convinced the regulators that indeed birds could tell treated and untreated seeds. They said that if they gave them this two-choice test of treated or untreated seed to a red-winged blackbird um, in sort of a caged environment, that when they ate a little bit of the treated seed, they got sick, and they had stopped eating from that seed dish that had the treated seeds in it. So we actually thought, well, that's interesting, but I doubt that could be relevant to the field. So we went out and did some more work to try and understand if this could happen in the real world. So my student, Shuchi Ren, was working on this project for the last couple of years. And here we caught farmland birds in a variety of settings before seeding. So before the farmers were seeding fields as well as after seeding, mostly in late April and May through early June. We took blood samples from a variety of different birds you can see in photos here. And we also color banded them as well as tried a technique using RFID or pit tags. This is kind of the same technology they use in, your pets where you get a pit tag injected into your cat or dog, or you can have them on your key ring to get in through doors. So pit tags are just tiny, tiny little devices that can register the individual number. And we hid the RFID readers underneath a baited seed pile, and we put a film camera or a trail camera next to it to try and observe which birds came to the treated or untreated seed piles and whether or not they returned back again, whether the same individuals returned. So here's just some quick video footage to show you a little bit about what we saw in the film. Unfortunately, our RFIDs did not work. None of the birds who we tagged came back to these baited seed stations. But we did see a whole lot of video footage of birds. This is cowbirds all coming to the seed pile. So we saw a lot of interesting behaviors, and they find these pit piles pretty quickly and consume them. We even saw mammals. This is a white-tailed deer eating the whole pile. So these were all 250-gram piles, and they definitely saw a range of mammals as well as birds. I'll only talk about the bird data since we're focused on that for today's talk, but suffice to say, we did see a large number of mammals as well. But for birds, in the 2 years we did the study, we saw a lot of birds come to these camera traps with the baited seeds. Brown-headed cowbirds were one of the most common, as well as Canada goose. But you can see a huge number of species were detected. So everything from Vesper sparrows and blackbirds, robins, etc. So we had a large number of species at these piles. And when we sampled blood of birds of all these different species, we found a very high detection rate of neonicotinoids in their blood. So some of the species had all 3 common neonicotinoids in their blood. And we also saw on average about 3/4 of the blood samples we took had some detectable neonicotinoid in it. And the concentrations for some species were very high. So we were rather surprised by that, how prevalent it is. However, we do know now from the literature that lots of species now have been seeing neonicotinoids detected in their tissues. So I'm showing here seed-eating birds, but there's also non-seed-eating birds that have very high frequency of detection. And so some of the work from other researchers and my own lab now are really confirming that these chemicals are really everywhere, and that birds are picking them up through a range of sources in their environment. So you might now ask, well, okay, they're eating the stuff, they're exposed to it, but like, are these things toxic? You know, how toxic are they? And particularly to some of those small seed-eating birds. So we sought to try and answer that question by doing a study on captive white-crowned sparrows. We initially tested the sparrows that we brought into captivity during spring migration. These were birds that were already fat because they were on stopover. And we tested them using very low doses of the chemical imidacloprid over 3 days. So our control birds are the black line shown here, and they maintain their body weight or their body mass over the 3 days pretty much throughout the experiment. But here's what happened to the low dose birds in darker blue and the high dose birds in lighter blue. The low dose birds lost about 17% of their body weight over 3 days, and the high dose birds lost a quarter of their body weight over that 3 days. That's a lot, because indeed the amount we were giving them that caused this effect was just the equivalent of them eating about a third of a corn seed or less than 4 canola seeds each day that would be treated with the neonicotinoids. So that amounts to less than 1% of their daily diet. So really very incidental amounts would cause this rapid weight loss. And we've now tested this again in birds. White-crowned sparrows have been our model species, but we've also tested this in other species of birds. And we know that one of the reasons that they lose such a large amount of mass so quickly is because they simply stop eating. So we saw a 70% reduction in their food intake. They subsequently rapidly reduced their body mass and their body fat. And even in 6 hours, they can lose up to 6% of their body mass. And indeed, this is pretty severe. For red-winged blackbirds, they're not quite as sensitive overall. We have to give them higher doses, but the same pattern occurs when we do feed them these chemicals or give them a dose of these chemicals. They reduce their food consumption rapidly, and they reduce their body mass. So this is a pretty common anorexic effect that we're seeing in songbirds. But we've also tested birds free living, so those that we captured on migration. In this case, we did this in southern Ontario, where there's a lot of these MODIS towers, which are stations that can detect birds wearing a radio tag. When we captured them, we made sure they were in migratory condition. We held them over, lost their body fat, and they reduced their food intake. But importantly, so birds have lost their body mass. And in doing that, of course, we worry about, are they going to be able to migrate? So we did another study where we took captive birds, or took birds out of the wild, white-crowned sparrows. We held them overnight. We ensured they were in migratory condition. And then we gave them a very low dose of that imidacloprid, either a low dose or a slightly higher dose. These were all extremely low and would be representing sort of eating about 1 canola seed. So it's really tiny doses. And then we release them with a radio tag into the MODIS telemetry network, which, if you know anything about MODIS, these are a series of towers. In southern Ontario, there's a very high density of them, and birds can be picked up on that tower based on that radio tag that they're wearing, so automatically recorded. And what we found that after the birds were released into the wild, this caused a significant delay in their overall migration. So they seemed like they lost a lot of weight, and they simply have to recover from this, pesticide insult. And this delayed their overall migration by, on average, 3.5 days compared to the controls. So that's a pretty serious delay. I'm just checking in, Autumn, just to make sure you can still hear me and everything's good. Thank you.
Yes.
So now I've talked a little bit about these neonicotinoids and insecticides, and they can affect birds directly and indirectly, the combination of which is probably something that we have to seriously worry about for birds who are using agricultural environments, both on migration as well as to breed. And I'm going to just spend the last couple minutes just spending to walk you through a few of the solutions, because I'm basically giving you all the bad news story. And I want to just say a little bit about, what is the potential for solutions, because I think there are some, and the science is pointing to some future working with biodiversity. So just briefly, one of the sort of keys to this or clues to this solution is really the swallows. We all love swallows. They are gorgeous birds that come back every year, sort of dancing and catching these insects on the wing. And they are telling us a lot about one of the key solutions. One of the things we know about swallows, particularly tree swallows, is that they use aquatic insects as a food source, preferentially over terrestrial insects. So they'll eat both, but they really like aquatic insects. And they feed their chicks those aquatic insects in huge numbers. And we know that it's possible that they're feeding their chicks not only the good stuff that's coming from these aquatic insects, but also potentially they're feeding them the chemicals like the neonicotinoids. So we've been studying this. How much do they use aquatic resources compared to the terrestrial? And one of the cool things we've done is we've tagged little tree swallows with these GPS tags and mapped their sort of use of agricultural landscapes. And if you can look at this map really carefully, you'll see that this tree swallow, whose nest is here in the red, spent a lot of time over wetlands. And whenever they flew further away from the nest, the further they were, the more likely they were over water. So wetlands actually are hugely important for tree swallows in these agriculturally dominated environments. And that's where they're getting these aquatic insects. Unfortunately, though, they also are acquiring not only the aquatic insects, the good nutritional benefits, but they're also picking up some of these nasty chemicals along the way. And we see very high rates of detection of neonicotinoids in the blood of tree swallows. So imidacloprid, 100% detection, and clothianidin, 70% detection. Some differences among the sites, but in general, we do see very high frequency of detection of these pesticides. And when we've done some dosing studies with tree swallows to figure out how toxic these things are to swallows, they do see a reduction in body mass, much like I showed you in the sparrows. So when we give them imidacloprid and we give them clothianidin at different doses, you see a rapid change in body mass, much like we've seen elsewhere. But chicks can actually be, some of this damage from the pesticide can actually be offset by just having access to these aquatic insects, these aquatic resources. So if there's wetlands in their natural environment in high density, we actually found that nestlings grew faster. Even though they were dosed with pesticide, they actually grew faster at these wetland-rich sites compared to the dry sites. So the overall growth curve is higher in the blue, at least in 2023 when we had a severe drought year. They were growing faster, doing better, even though they were exposed to the pesticide. So that's a really encouraging sign. We can actually offset some of the damage and mitigate it by having wetlands. So here, in a canola surrounded field, lots of chemicals being used, but if wetlands are kept and maintained, it can actually help offset a lot of that damage to those swallows. So my main sort of takeaway here is protect and conserve our natural wetland buffers. We need to protect these buffers around wetlands, maintain them, and indeed we see higher macroinvertebrate abundance in wetlands that have been buffered. So agricultural environments that have wetlands already have a boost, but we need to do better to protect those wetlands and ensure that they are a good food source. Another sort of idea is that farmers can actually take some of their land that they've been cultivating that's probably not that great, it's marginal. And if we can turn that into some perennial forages and add more flowering species, we can increase the amount of insect diversity and bird diversity without affecting the farmer's bottom line. We've done this now with working directly with farmers. We've placed acoustic recorders on areas where the farmer took some land out of production and planted some diverse perennial forages, and even just 2 years after the treatment, after applying this perennial forage grasses in these marginal areas, we saw higher bird acoustic diversity compared to our control fields. So it didn't matter whether or not it was near a wetland or in some other saline or marginal area, as long as farmers were putting back some of this land to perennial forages, we can rapidly increase the biodiversity. And this is a pretty exciting revelation, because it didn't actually affect their bottom line, their yields, or their overall profitability, because these areas were already a bit marginal and they weren't producing enough to offset the costs associated with their inputs, their seed and chemical. So this was an encouraging sign. We're now actually trying to map where all these marginal lands are across the prairie region, and indeed, hopefully across Canada. The goal is to try and figure out where all the land that shouldn't be planted to crops could, and which has potential to be biodiversity set-asides. And then we can hopefully incentivize farmers to actually convert these areas. So this is a really exciting time, and we have some grants that are trying to push this, and Environment Canada is also really behind this, trying to get more marginal lands planted. Ducks Unlimited and some other NGOs are also very busy with this kind of projects to try and encourage farmers to plant perennial forages in their marginal lands. So the last thing I'll just say is that it's not that hard to reduce our overall chemical reliance. We can move from being a very monoculture system, which is heavily dependent, and as soon as we add a little bit of diversity back to these systems by planting some perennial areas with forages, or maintaining our shelter belts, maintaining those wetlands, we can actually have a solution that benefits or gives a win for farmers, but also can have benefits for bugs and birds. So with that, I'll stop there and ask if there are any questions. And if you, I think we have the Q&A, so we can use that. But also, if you want to reach out to me, I'll put my email address there, and I'm delighted to hear from anyone who has any other questions after the webinar is over. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christy. That was really interesting and insightful. We have a bunch of great questions in the Q&A function right now. So I'll just start at the top from Raquel. It looks like about double the area of the farm from 1966 to 2016 is crop. What was the land use before? Is it known? I think that was referring to the very first map you showed.
Yeah, absolutely. So a big reason we saw, well, the big changes that have happened have been not a huge expansion of crop area. There's been a little bit by losing wetlands and removing shelter belts and some sort of field margins, been a little bit of eating into that habitat. Grasslands have been converted into crop. And then a big thing that's happened that's kind of maybe offsetted or had some counter action is the conversion of having fallow fields, summer fallow, and having continuous cropping. So we used to leave fields fallow for a year, and then but now that's almost gone. There's almost no fallow fields. So in some ways, it looks like we're cropping more land, but indeed we actually don't necessarily crop more. We just kind of continuously crop, and there has been a little bit of a loss of some of those natural areas, which we could hopefully bring back, or at least protect what we have left.
Thank you. And a question from Susanna: do neonics bioaccumulate?
They actually, I never predicted that they would bioaccumulate. So bioaccumulation is a process where chemicals that have sort of a lipophilic property, that is, they're fat loving, accumulate in the tissues of animals that also have fat. And then if they accumulate in those tissues, let's say of an insect, potentially they can be transferred through the food chain to the next thing that eats them. And that we call biomagnification. Now, if you look at the properties, chemical properties of neonicotinoids, their sort of fat solubility or their sort of lipid-loving properties are very low. They actually shouldn't bioaccumulate. However, for a long time, I made that assumption. And then we started to see some aerial insectivores and other species that never eat treated seeds, never are exposed any other way. They had these neonicotinoids in their bodies. So we started to look into it. And indeed, you do see some bioaccumulation of these chemicals in insects. So some of the insects can become resistant to the chemical. They don't die, but they do accumulate it in their tissues, and they are able to transfer it through the food web.
Thank you. And then next question we have, sorry, we got a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to split
Sure.
up the different ones. Anne is wondering, what regenerative agricultural practices do you recommend to alleviate the effects to bird populations?
Oh,
Without,
yeah, I'm a huge fan of regenerative agricultural practices, in large part because although there's many practices that are drawn from organic agriculture, things like cover cropping, maintaining no-till, and ensuring that there's many living roots or deep living roots, as well as integrating livestock into cropping systems. They still use chemical in regenerative practices, but they use a lot less. And so the promise here is that it's actually a cheaper way to farm because there's fewer inputs required, but there is more labor involved. So it's, more complex farming, more difficult, but there's huge promise to add diversity through that cover cropping, through intercropping, and adding livestock, for example. And all of those things combined can be additive to really boost the system.
thank you. And then another question from Peter. He says, in Europe, they think they monitor streams for residual pesticides. Is this done in North America, if you know? I guess
In the
yeah.
US, they are doing it. Yes, they monitor. There's a whole extensive stream monitoring network for pesticides, including urban areas. In Canada, we had a system of monitoring pesticides. It died, I guess, maybe about 20 years ago. And there's a recent Canadian water monitoring network that's being reinitiated. It's still in its pilot phase by PMRA. Health Canada is leading that in combination with Environment Canada, but it's still in its infancy stage. So we are quite far behind in terms of monitoring pesticides in surface waters, but there is an impetus to bring that back.
That's exciting, and I hope it is brought back.
Mm-hmm.
Raquel is wondering, maybe this is a bit of a personal question, but how do you keep from getting angry when it comes to the ways in which maybe corporations or lobby groups
Yeah,
bring
great
their
question,
agenda
Raquel.
forward?
Great question. Well, I stick to the science. That's one thing. So I really, I try to stay impartial. But I also have been doing a lot of policy relevant science. So we've been trying to do some solutions-based science. That is to, rather than just fight at getting bans of chemicals, because we've said, these cause all these harms. I've found that to be very ineffective. Rather, the more effective strategy is to get involved in things like the living labs or these marginal areas, prairie precision marginal areas where we can try and map where all the marginal lands and use that as tools to help farmers make better decisions, give them the opportunities. I have huge hope that because we go over every square inch of that 7% of Canada's agricultural land multiple times a year, and we actually have it mapped. Every farmer almost has onboard GPS sensing systems. They collect insane amounts of data on their fields every square meter. There is a massive potential to do farming differently. And there is some early adopters who are really doing that. We just haven't got it mainstream yet. But I do have tremendous hope because it's one of the few kind of areas where we have potential to actually shift the way we do it. And of course, yeah, I try to use my science in that way to influence by providing data. But, you know, there are days where I'm frustrated too. Yeah, definitely. The biggest one was, if I have to be honest, is that neonics were proposed to be banned in 2016. And in 2021, that ban was reversed. So that was a bit of a hard blow.
Oh, definitely. And do you know why that may have been, Christy?
Oh, it's a long story, but the short version, the Coles Notes version, is that industry had a very strong influence in affecting the regulators' sort of assessment and overall decision. So it was originally banned or proposed to be banned because of the water quality contamination, or water contamination from neonicotinoids was found to be above those critical thresholds for aquatic life. And then the industry went out and collected a lot of data themselves to try and counter that. And then they sort of used a variety of techniques to sort of wash the data sets and manipulate the overall assessment. They also used some of these kind of lines where, you know, saying birds could learn to avoid eating treated seeds and things like that. So there were a number of ways that they were influencing the regulators' decisions. Which is disappointing, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. I'll just roll into the next question here from Laura. Any tips from a food consumer's perspective, I guess, in reducing their
Yeah,
exposure?
yeah, definitely. I mean, everybody goes to the organic, right? I think that's, you know, the no-brainer is, you know, choose organic, but organic can be expensive. I realize that. But, you know, even knowing where your food comes from, you know, and asking questions. There is a great deal of power in the consumer shifting the way the market is operating. So if consumers are choosing through purchasing, you know, like to not purchase things that are generated from industrial agricultural practices, then they are making a choice, and that is having a big influence at these large roundtables where the industry is listening. They are seeing that consumers don't want so much chemical use. They do care about bees and birds and bugs. And so they are actually responding to that. And that way that does influence what how farmers grow the food.
Great, thank you. And I do also see we have two folks with their hands raised, or one individual with their hands raised. Would you like to come off mute to ask your question there? If you'd like to, or if your mic isn't working, you can post in the chat there. Just come off mute. You should be able to ask your question to Christy. Hello?
Go. Yeah.
Are you there?
Just the sound is not quite right. I can answer while you're maybe sorting out the
Sure.
microphone. Julie just had a question about treated seeds, and I think this is a common one for backyard bird feeders. So people who are buying black oil sunflower seeds or other kind of seed, and are these contaminated basically, or where can they get clean seed? We did test a number of seeds, like bird seed, from you know, reputable suppliers like Wild Birds Unlimited, and we did find generally none or very low concentrations of neonicotinoids in seed products that were designed for backyard bird feeding. Great news, of course, to hear that. But it is very difficult to source organic seed. And there is sort of low-level background contamination of many seed products or food products. It's just that the treated seed that I'm talking about is what the farmer puts in the ground. So even a sunflower that's planted with a treated seed, a small amount will get on into the plant, only about 5%. And of that, how much ends up in the actual seed it produces on the plant for harvesting and for consumption is very low. So there's relatively low risk from that source. Not no risk, but relatively low. So the bigger concern is just when farmers are planting the seeds with the chemical coating on them.
Thank you, Christy. Peter's wondering, why do you think the chicks double in size when close to the water area, and if there's been similar studies done on bats?
Oh, yeah, good question. So we now know that the aquatic insects contain very important sources of nutrition that are different or distinct from terrestrial invertebrates. So not all bugs are the same. Aquatic invertebrates contain omega-3s, which you probably have heard about for your own health. You should be taking omega-3s. These are long chain fatty acids that have nutritional benefits. They have cardiovascular benefits. They fight inflammation, and they also have been shown in birds to cause more rapid growth, even when birds have less food available. So they can grow bigger and faster, even if they're fed less, but fed that high quality aquatic high omega-3 foods. So when they're near wetlands, they actually are getting more of that very nutritious prey, and it's even better than the terrestrial bugs. So this is why we say we got to keep the water, we got to keep the wetlands. And indeed, for you and I, we should eat our fish, fish and things that are and algal sources of omega-3s. They're very good for you.
Great. Dawn is wondering about your slides. There's a way that folks could access some more details on your research to share with others. I know your lab website, I believe I linked in the Zoom registration.
Yeah. I mean, lots of our stuff is published. We've certainly, I know that this is a terrible thing to say for scientists to tell the public that you should read our publications, because that's why I do these talks, because nobody really reads scientific publications. But we have published it. If someone's really interested in digging into the details, I'm happy to have you email me, and I can provide the specifics to give you a little bit more. I really am just showing you kind of highlights of a lot of different studies we've done, but I'm more than happy to show you a little bit more detail. Feel free to reach out.
That sounds great. I think I'm one of the few folks who likes nerding out on literature.
Yeah, scientific literature. But yeah, I mean, I think that's why I do these webinars, because I can digest a lot of the information and give you a 1-hour webinar instead of you having to read all of them. But I do appreciate when people contact me who are keen to hear, like, want more meat, want more details, and I'm always happy to share that with you.
We still have time for maybe a few more questions, if that's okay with you, Christy?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to save lots of time for questions.
Pekka is wondering, how much problems do you think herbicides are causing, and why do you think the neonics were leading to weight loss in birds?
Yeah, okay, so herbicides are a really interesting issue. Of course, we hear a lot about glyphosate in the news. Glyphosate is Roundup, the commercial name Roundup. But we don't test for Roundup or glyphosate in a lot of our samples for water, because it's basically in every single wetland. It's 100% detection, and it's a very expensive analysis. So we tend to just assume it's there. But herbicides as a whole are not inert. They are not non-toxic, which some people believe, like when they're using it in their home and garden, they think it's kind of, not a problem. They are not inert. They are not non-toxic. And certainly cumulative exposures over a long period of time, even to low levels of herbicides, can be problematic for humans as well as indeed wildlife. The bigger issue with insecticides like the neonicotinoids is that they cause acute toxicity with very low concentrations. So these are the chemicals that are really problematic in the short term. So it's not to say that they are, that herbicides are somehow, non-toxic. They are, but you need more of them, and you need to be exposed to them for longer, typically to cause the same type of harms as you might see from an insecticide like a neonicotinoid. And then the other question, I'm sorry, I forgot, what was the other part?
About the weight loss.
Weight loss, yes. So why do neonics cause weight loss? The mechanism, we believe, is simply through gastrointestinal distress. That is, the birds exhibit excessive salivation. They can't really vomit, but they probably feel like they're going to vomit, and they simply become sort of physically ill to their stomach, which makes them stop eating. And when they stop eating, they rapidly lose weight, particularly in a bird that's fat and ready to migrate. They are already putting on fat, and they're all sort of geared up to be gaining mass. When they stop eating, they rapidly lose it. So there is a little bit of a toxicity effect. There is some activation of toxic mechanisms that cause some of the weight loss, but most of it seems to be caused by simply not eating because they feel sick.
Oh,
If they do survive, the good news is if they don't get quite high enough toxic dose and survive it, they can recover. But it could take, but in that recovery period, they may be susceptible to all kinds of things, predators, weather, certainly exposure and weakness from that chemical exposure. So, but if they do survive, some of them will recover, and they can go on to migrate or to move on.
that's positive then.
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you
It's
so
just the
much.
difference between enough that, like, them getting sick and not dying, but getting sick and then dying is like the threshold is really thin line. So just a little bit more could cause death, and that's the unfortunate thing.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Christy, for your time today and sharing your research with us. It's been fantastic. I'm so sorry if I didn't get a chance to all your amazing questions for everyone in the chat, but please do get in touch with Christy if you have any other questions. And thank you all so much for coming today. The recording, I'm going to just go ahead and pause it now.